Well, hey, everybody, and welcome to Theology Thursday. Welcome back. This is the second week that Doug and I are diving into this. Doug, it is good to see you, buddy. How you doing?
I'm doing great. How about you?
I'm doing great, man. Got my iced coffee here in my little emergence mug. It's been keeping me running this morning.
Yeah, and I'm in my little hole, my basement office in the laundry room.
The
And
Hobbit
as
hole.
you can see behind me on the far shelf, that is an original Rancor monster toy from the original Hasbro Return of the Jedi series.
That's awesome. I
He'll
didn't even
probably
notice that.
he may feature in some of the future videos.
Nice. I like it.
Yeah.
All right, Doug. So for this week, for Theology Thursday, we had kind of two things in mind. First, we wanted to follow up with a little bit of some of the kind of commentary that spilled out from our discussion this week in Matthew 26. And then also, we wanted to talk about one thing kind of in particular that has kind of come up as a question before in the past, which is the idea of kind of Jesus descending into hell. And so we'll elaborate on that a little bit more. But before we go there, Doug, this week in Matthew 26, we were talking, Jesus is being arrested. We went through this together in a separate video, but specifically for the theology point, there were a couple things that kind of came up. And from the text this week, one of the big ones that is kind of sitting there is the idea of destroying the temple, right? Jesus is saying that this temple will be destroyed. And so you wrote some great commentary in here for our leaders, for our community group leaders, and I was hoping that you might actually expand upon that a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no problem. So, yeah, during Jesus's trial, this is obviously a very informal trial. It's not meant to be really anything official. If anything, they're just kind of trying to get everyone on the same page as to what are we going to go and bring before Pilate to destroy him, to destroy Jesus.
Basically
And
trying to figure out a way to accuse Jesus and to bring some kind of charge.
yes, that would carry a death sentence.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because as we mentioned in the leadership podcast, they did not really have the authority to put someone to death. The instances of either attempts or in the New Testament going through with it, like with the stoning of Stephen in the book of Acts, that's mob justice. Those are lynchings. But what these guys want is to have him executed as an official criminal, and and do it that way.
Like
Yeah,
through the
and
legal
so
process. So
yes.
you mentioned in the podcast that we recorded earlier, Doug. So basically, the Jewish authorities, there's this kind of like mob justice type of thing, but they're trying to go through the actual legal authorities, which in this case and in this time is the Roman,
Which would have been the
occupation.
Roman governor, i.e., Pontius Pilate, and
Sure.
it's there. One of the in the community discussion guide this week. One of the questions is to dig around and try to find some points of irony, and I think one of the particular points of irony is that so that they're bringing false witnesses here, right? It specifically says that verse 59, the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus that they might put him to death, but they found none, though many false witnesses came forward. And then it says at last two came forward. So what are they looking to do? Now, notice they've got plenty of people who are willing to bear false testimony against Jesus, but they need two. And that's because in the law of Moses, if you're bringing a formal charge, you need at least 2 or 3 witnesses. That's kind of like one of the measures that's meant to ensure reliable testimony in a court of law in an age long before forensic science and stuff like that. So you need at least 2 witnesses. Other interesting aspects of the law of Moses would be that if you come bearing false witness, and it's found out that you bear false witness, then you are actually subjected to the penalty that the defendant would have been subject to. So there's little ways of ensuring that witnesses remain accurate. But what's ironic here, right, is that they're seeking out that requirement for more than one witness, agreeing on the same thing, but they're seeking out false witnesses, right? And that's directly against one of the 10 commandments, right? You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. So they're so concerned with getting 2, but they're sifting the whole pool of applicants here are false witnesses. So that's an ironic point here.
Craziness.
But the thing that that I think is worth looking into a little bit more is that when the high priest eventually does question Jesus, his name is Caiaphas, Joseph ben Caiaphas. Actually, we know of him from history.
How do you know that?
Because we know of him from history, from extra biblical sources. We know
Okay.
a lot about like how he came to power and everything, and even some archaeological remains bearing his name.
So, Doug, while we're here, actually, let me ask you a couple more questions about Caiaphas.
Mhm.
He's the religious ruler of
He's the
the
chief
Jews, right?
priest. Yeah,
Chief
the chief
priest, right?
priest.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on kind of how that structure kind of works?
Sure. So the there's formal and informal Jewish religious leaders in the gospel. The informal ones are going to be the Pharisees. This is a lay movement that is concerned that the Jewish people, though they are back in their land, they are still formally under God's judgment, and some would even say in exile,
Mm,
because they are not, there's no, they do not have their own king. They're living under the Roman thumb. And so they believe there's this very zealous movement, and that's a kind of a formal terminology. You recall that Simon is called a zealot, one of the disciples.
right.
Um, and Paul refers to himself as zealous for the law when he was a Pharisee. And so the idea is that these guys were like, all right, Roman occupation is horrible. We need to get out from, and they're interpreting Roman occupation as God's continuing judgment on the nation. And so how do we get out of that? Well, we need to make sure that we're living exceptionally pure lives. And that's where that concern for these purity boundary markers is so much in the forefront. So they're concerned about obviously circumcision, but Sabbath keeping and ritual purity, the kinds of, and not only for themselves, right? These Pharisees say, not only do we ourselves have to be doing this, but we need to make sure that everyone else is too.
Mm,
And so you can see why they're so concerned about whether Jesus is keeping the Sabbath. And that's
right.
my daughter crawling around my office. There's
So even to this too. So obviously they're the ones that are ensuring that everybody's keeping all these religious policies and traditions and everything else, and keeping the rules, so to speak. And so
Mhm.
it's to these folks that Jesus is actually talking about the destruction of the temple here,
Yeah,
which we can only imagine, comes even 10 times over, you know what I
yeah,
mean? It magnified in the way that Jesus is kind of saying this.
yeah. So that's so the thing to keep in mind. So the Pharisees are kind of your informal religious teachers,
Hmm.
and but the religious leaders, and then but then you also have the Sadducees, and they're the ones who at this time kind of control the priesthood.
Okay.
Now their theological beliefs are a little different than the Pharisees. They tend to have place all their eggs in the basket of this world. Right?
Mm.
There's little hope in resurrection from the dead, belief in supernatural. A lot of supernatural interventions on the part of God and everything like that, but particularly a denial of this hope of future resurrection. And that's one of the things that comes to the fore often in the New Testament, several times in Jesus's ministry, and also in during Paul's trial in the book of Acts. Um,
And so
but
Caiaphas then is
so
a Sadducee.
Caiaphas would have been a Sadducee, yes, because they
Okay.
control the priesthood. And the Sanhedrin is this formal, there's supposed to be 71 of them, like elders of the Jews, who get together and have this kind of formal council. Now, whether all 71 were there at Jesus's trial is debated. You probably had them coming and going throughout the night. But yeah, that's what's going on. That's who Jesus is before. And by the way, the high priesthood is something. One of the points of resentment for very pious Jews was that Herod was actually the one who appointed the Caiaphas as high priest, and so it's not even, it's a very, you have this guy who's kind of like a perhaps you could call him a gino, a Jew in name only, um,
Okay.
who appoints the high priest. So there's a lot of
Okay.
dissatisfaction with Caiaphas.
And so we've already seen, so Caiaphas is the one appointed by Herod. We've already seen Herod move, you know what I
Yeah,
mean? We know Herod ends up, taking, it was Herod, right? That ends up killing John the Baptist
Yes.
in some crazy fashion to, satisfy
Hmm.
some random woman's desire. And
Hmm.
so here we are, we have his Sadducee appointed Caiaphas, and he's looking for false witnesses to bear witness against
And
Jesus for an
and
illegal trial.
and finally we come to the thing where we set out to talk about, and that is that Caiaphas asks Jesus, he says, I adjure you by the living God, tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. Um, Now, we've mentioned throughout our study on Matthew that so Christ is not Jesus's last name. Christ means anointed one. It is the Greek term Christos, kind of transliterated into English, Christ. And it is the equivalent of the Hebrew Mashiach, which is Messiah.
Okay.
And both of these terms mean anointed one. And the idea is that kings were anointed with oil at their coronation, when they're recognized as the king of Israel. So when he's asking that, he's saying, I'm going to put this question to you, Jesus. Do you think that you are the coming son of David, the king who's been promised, who will reign over God's people? That's what he's asking himself.
Which is a very specific question. I don't mean to interrupt you, Doug, but I know
No.
there's a lot of folks that when they read the Bible, and a lot of folks when they first become Christians, or maybe are just kind of exploring who Jesus is, one question that we hear a lot is, or I guess a statement is like, well, Jesus never actually calls himself God. Jesus never declares himself to be God or the Son of God or anything else. He never declares that, and so here, especially, while we're hanging out here in Matthew 26, it's like, here it is, in big, bold print, they're basically asking him directly, are you the Messiah?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Now, I think it's important to keep in mind that the questions about whether Jesus is the Messiah, the question over that is different than whether or not he is the second person of the Trinity, whether or not he's God incarnate, right? That's going to come to us from different things. So in other words,
That's a good point.
So, right, because the Jewish people of Jesus's day were not expecting, nor in the Old Testament expectation, although there are a few subtle things. There's the claim to be the Messiah is not necessarily a claim to be God.
That's interesting. And I think the reason why I connect those two in my head, Doug, is because of what Peter says earlier, right? Because, when Jesus asks Peter and he says, who do you say that I am?
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm not looking at it.
Caiaphas connects them here too.
Yeah. So Peter actually says, right, you are the Christ. You are the Son of God.
The Son of the living God. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I guess in my head, I hear the connection there.
So the idea that, all right. So we've already said Doug. Christ is Messiah, the word Christ. So when he says you're the Christ, he's saying you are the king. Mm-hmm. But the thing to keep in mind is that Son of God is a title given to kings in the line of David. So if you go back to 2 Samuel 7, which is one of those passages that all Christians should have in their back pocket, we should all know what's there in 2 Samuel 7. That is God's covenant with David, right? And it's a super interesting passage, very, very interesting. But part of what God promises David in this passage, if you go down to, let's say, verse 12, we'll start in verse 12. He says, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. Okay. And then he goes on, yada, yada, yada. And he talks about his throne being established forever. So these are the
yada, yada, God.
I yada, yada. Yes. It's a very Jewish thing to say. So these are the seeds of the Davidic covenant. These are the seeds that this Christology that Jesus walks into in the New Testament, or exhibits in the New Testament. This is where that is planted, and this idea that the kings who reign in the line of David are going to be regarded by God as his son. Now, there is a sense, of course, in which the entire nation of Israel is also considered God's son in the Old Testament. So uh, uh, Moses is commanded to tell Pharaoh, for example, Israel is my firstborn son, let my son go. And Hosea 11:1, out of Egypt I called my son. There the whole nation is being called God's son, but in a special way, the king is called God's son. We see this also in Psalm 2, verse 7, where he says, and this is the Davidic king speaking. I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, or Yahweh said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. So this is the coronation of the king of Israel. And on that coronation, he is given the title Son of God and the status of God's son. So all I'm saying, so I think we need to be very clear that especially in the Gospels, often Son of God is a Son of God is a Christological type title, meaning it is a messianic title. It has to do with kingship. So when he says, are you the Christ, the Son of the living God, he's essentially saying the same thing two different ways. He's essentially asking the same thing. Now, that's not to say that Son of God language doesn't get ratcheted up in the New Testament to where it becomes legitimate to think of Jesus as the second person of the Trinity. I'm not saying that language is not at all. Even in the Synoptic Gospels, we have that a little bit. But I think what we need to say is that language keeps growing and growing and growing, and it gets more and more significant, and eventually becomes a divine title. But it is not that in the minds of Jesus's Jewish interlocutors during his lifetime.
That's interesting. So you just blew my mind here, Doug, actually, because I didn't realize that the term son of God or God's son could actually be attributed to something other than Jesus. So then the obvious question here, right, especially because we started with kind of the the argument is like, well, Jesus never calls himself God's son or the second person of the Trinity. So the obvious question in the room is like, well, then how can we conclude that, right? Looking at Scripture.
Okay. So this is a little bit of a different discussion here, but yeah. So
I know I'm taking you down a little bit of a path, Doug. It's only because for these sessions, normally we record a leader's commentary, but for these ones specifically on Theology Thursday, you know what I mean? We've got a little bit wider of an audience. So
okay, so I would say that Jesus's divinity comes out more strongly in the Gospels through what he does than what he says. Okay. So now, of course, there are certain things that Jesus does say in the Gospels. John is particularly strong in this way, which is one of the arguments that people will use, that John is late, because they'll say that it has this high developed Christology, right? So it's later in the first century than the other Gospels, because that's by then this theology of Jesus as God has really formally crystallized. And in some sense that might be true. In another sense, it's I don't think it's that solid of an argument, because we have very high Christology in books that probably predate all of the Gospels. So a lot of Paul's writings are before the Gospels, and Paul, in some very important passages, gives us very high Christology where he does seem to be equating Jesus with the Father in terms of his divinity. And that's even more striking, as some more recent scholars have pointed out, particularly Richard Bauckham, in that this is arising in a Jewish setting, right? A heavily Jewish monotheistic setting, right? Where a human individual who is crucified is believed to be God himself. That is a very, very big thing that has to be explained on any count of first century Christianity. But when I say that So
well, I was going to say, so similar to that, you know what I mean? Just understanding the context of what that's happening, like, to the point that we're kind of studying through here, when Jesus is being asked, are you the Christ? It's a
yeah,
very specific question, very, very specific
yes,
question.
yeah, exactly. And now, as I said, the places where Jesus is specifically speaking of himself as God, or like where you get the real explicit stuff, you do get that in the Gospel of John. So some of the examples there would be like, of course, the big one is at the end of chapter 8, where Jesus tells the people who are ready to stone him. He says, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. And most people rightly pick up that Jesus is there alluding to God's revelation of himself to Moses and calling himself I am who I am
Genesis.
in Exodus
Or
3:14.
Exodus, I mean.
Yeah, but and interestingly, something that's often also missed is that there are a bunch of other passages. There's one in Deuteronomy 32:39, and then a bunch of other ones in Isaiah chapter 41, 43, 45, where God says the exact same thing. And Jesus uses the exact same language. It's probably a little bit much to get into that here.
Sure.
We could do that at a different time. But at any rate, and if there's any doubt as to, well, Jesus says, I am a bunch of other places, and he's not claiming to be God. Well, it's obviously thought of as meaning that by the people who are listening to him, because they pick up stones to stone him because they think he's a blasphemer. Here's Lacey. Hi, Lacey.
Hey, Lacey.
Hi. Okay, gotta go to mommy. Okay, we're recording. Love you.
Down the road, Doug, I think we should, I'm just thinking forward for the next Theology Third, or maybe another deep dive. We should jump into God's name.
Yeah, we should do that. We might even be able to do that next week. Well, I
think on it.
I'm kind of learning not to put labels on to when we're going to do stuff, but yeah.
Then we're nailing our shoes in the ground.
Yeah. I mean, there's other important places in John as well, like where they pick up stones to another occasion where they pick up stones to stone him, and he says, "I've done many good works. For which of them are you going to stone? Are you trying to stone me?" And they say, "It's not for any good work that we're looking to stone you, but because you, a man, make yourself out to be God." And then at the end of the Gospel of John, when no, you can't have a lollipop, Lacey. You got to go. I'm recording. You can have a lollipop when you do poo-poo on the potty. That's the rule in our house right now. Pro tip.
Nice.
So at any rate,
if I come over, Doug, does that apply for me as well?
Yeah, certainly. Definitely. You could get a lollipop for that. Or
Sweet.
for making me some delicious coffee.
I can do that too.
That's where, right. Although not on the potty. Alex does not make coffee on the potty.
Red flag my coffee.
But the other big thing in the Gospel of John is when he's risen and he's showing himself to his disciples, and he shows himself to Thomas, doubting Thomas, and Thomas exclaims to him, "My Lord and my God," right? And Jesus receives and accepts this. But in the gospel, in the synoptic gospels, the other gospels like Matthew, we have much more subtler things. So Jesus, the paralytic is lowered before him, right? And he's like, and everybody's there watching him. And he says, "Take care, your sons are forgiven." And they say, "Who can forgive sins but God alone?" Right? And Jesus is like, "Just so you know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, rise and walk." Right? So this idea, indeed, who can forgive sins but God alone? And then other things like one that I think is very interesting. And then we'll move on after this. But another one, Kara, can you please close the door, honey? I'm recording right now. Love you.
Doug, you remind me of that one. Did you ever see that? There's a viral video that went. There was a guy that was being interviewed live on the news radio, and his kids come walking in. And
I remember that. Yeah.
They just bust open the door and come walking right into the background.
I feel like it's more understandable right now, like in the coronavirus quarantine. Here's an interesting one, right? So Jesus calms the storm, right? His disciples are freaking out, and he calms the storm, and then they're marveling at it, and they say, "Who is this then that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Right? Now, again, these are Jewish guys. And you go to a passage like Psalm 107:23. I'm a popular guy today. And here's what Psalm 107:23 says. Okay. So let me flip to it a second here. And following. Listen to the narrative here. It almost sounds like the Gospels. Some went down to the sea in ships, doing business on the great waters. They saw the deeds of the Lord, his wondrous works in the deep. For he commanded and raised the stormy wind, which lifted up the waves of the sea. They mounted up to heaven. They went down to the depths. Their courage melted away in their evil plight. They reeled and staggered like drunken men. They were at their wits' end. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed, right? So here are these guys saying, who is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? And the idea, the implication there is, I think you know exactly who this is. So, yeah, more that can be said about that. But we've riffed on it for a while. But yeah, that's
sure.
Just some thoughts on that.
So Doug, the last kind of point that we wanted to cover for this kind of episode of Theology Thursday here was kind of this thought that I think stems out of the Apostles' Creed, right? There's this notion that Jesus descends into hell, right? And we've gotten this question a couple times, and I know that we kind of wanted to answer that together and spend some more time. We alluded to this in the last podcast we recorded. So you want to help guide us through this a little bit, Doug? Where does this idea kind of come from? The idea of Jesus descending into hell to raise others out, or whatever else?
Shifting gears, so subtly. Yeah. Yeah. So this is something that if you're not talking about it this week, it'll come up inevitably pretty soon. So yeah. The idea is common. This question, what did Jesus do in the 3 days when he was in the earth, or how we're counting the days, and I think it's perfectly plausible to say I don't really know where Jesus was or what he was doing, but one of the options that is out there is the idea that Jesus went to hell. And you could kind of address this from a theological standpoint or from a biblical standpoint. We're going to take a little bit more of a biblical standpoint, but the idea is very exemplified in the Apostles' Creed, which is a common confession of the church. It's a good confession of the church. I affirm it. We all should. But there are different versions of it. Now, the Apostles' Creed, and I'll read the first couple lines and then I'll stop at the phrase in question. Now, I am reading the official Roman Catholic version. There are other versions of it that are worded differently, but the wording is specific in the Roman Catholic version. It says, I believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his only Son, our Lord, who was conceived by the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried. He descended into hell. On the third day, he rose again from the dead and ascended into heaven, and is seated at the right hand of God, the Father Almighty. And without any lack of reverence, I'll just stop there because I'm not looking at the whole thing today. Sure. But the phrase "he descended into hell." As I said, some of the other creeds are worded differently, I think, to reflect the biblical language a little bit better. But this is the version that is in the current Catholic version and has been for quite some time. So the idea that Jesus went to hell, again, I said you could, coming at it from a theological angle would be to say something like, well, Jesus took our judgment upon himself, and we are deserving of hell. And so if he took our judgment, then that means he would have to go to hell. So if we were to address it from that perspective, then that would be the theological perspective. I want to say, where would we get the idea that Jesus descended into hell from the Bible?
Right. And so that was real quick, Doug, that was actually one of the questions I wanted to ask you. So we have this Apostles' Creed, right, which kind of exists, and many folks have heard it before, whether, you've kind of grown up hearing it before, heard it prayed before, or if you grew up Catholic or anything else. There's two questions I kind of want to ask. The first one is, where did this creed actually come from? How did this even come about? And now that it's kind of in church tradition, and where do we actually see the idea of Jesus descending in Scripture? And so I don't know, Doug, if you could, can I ask you that? Can you speak to kind of where these things came from?
The creed is present in its early forms. It develops throughout the centuries, and I'm not an expert on this by any means. So honestly, Wikipediaing the Apostles' Creed would give you a better history than I would be able to do. Sure. But I know I can say that creeds were very important ever since the formation of the church. There's several passages in the New Testament that are almost certainly creeds. Which is interesting because that demonstrates that the theology, that's evidence that the theology is there before the writings. But then we start to get creedal development in some of the early church fathers, and eventually we start getting it in the forms that we have now. So you get like the Nicene Creed, the creed that was hammered out at Nicaea, which is distinct from this, although similar. And that's going to be, I think Nicaea is 329 or.
Uh-oh. Doug, you still with us? I think we lost Dougie. All right. So while Doug figures out his internet connection, I'm going to vamp for a second and probably say that as far as the creeds are kind of looked at in the moment, that this is something that has developed extracurricular for the church to just kind of declare what it is that they believe. And the one that Doug was actually reading from is the one that's known as the Apostles' Creed. And like Doug mentioned already, it's the current Catholic version of the Apostles' Creed. And so in there, this specific line that's talking about he descended into hell. He was crucified, died, and was buried. He descended into hell. On the third day, he rose again from the dead. He ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of God the Father. So far, Doug even mentioned before that he affirms this creed, but there is this one line that's kind of in question, this idea that Jesus descended into hell. And so we have the creed on one side, and what we're going to do now is actually dive into Ephesians a little bit and talk through just kind of where we get this idea from a little bit, the idea of Jesus descending. And so we're going to jump in that here in just a second. I'm going to jump off real quick and help Doug figure out his internet connection, and we'll see you in a second. All right, and we're back. Welcome back, Doug. Did you figure out what's going on with your internet over there?
No, I didn't figure out what's going on, but whenever gives me any trouble, I do the old unplug, replug thing, and seems Smart. To be fixed. Yeah.
Smart move. Well, I was able to take a macadamia nut break, so I'm thankful for
I got some of those upstairs waiting for me.
Rock and roll.
Yeah.
All right, Doug. So before we jumped off here in a second ago, we were taking a look at the Apostles' Creed and kind of how that's come about, and a statement of belief, kind of that basically what a creed or a credo, I guess to say, is a statement of belief, right? Here's what we adhere to. We do this together as a church when we walk through membership. We kind of walk through our own kind of statements of belief. And so the Apostles' Creed is a form of that. But what we wanted to jump in, I'm sorry, Doug, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to add that, sometimes, especially for evangelicals, there's certain words that can sound kind of rub us the wrong way. You know what I mean? And creed, I think, creeds and confessions sometimes sound like that, are like that. But I think it's important to realize that those creeds are not dirty words. They are very important. And in fact, we are a creedal church, whether we put it that way or not. So when somebody says, like, what do you need to believe to belong to Emergence, to be a member at Emergence, right? We don't say, here you go, that's what you need to believe, right? Like, I mean, we do say we believe the Bible, right?
Right.
But when you're saying, like, what do you believe? What do you give them? You give them a series of doctrines. We're centered around a creed. And there are certain things that we specifically say are at the center of that creed, right? Like, we're not going to require our members to believe like these super specific esoteric facts about the Bible, even if they're true.
Mm.
You know what I mean? Like, it's not like, we believe in God the Father, maker of heaven and earth. And we believe that Abraham was circumcised in his old, you know what I mean? Like, it's not
Right.
like
Yeah.
all these like random things. So yeah, we creeds are distillations of the Christian faith, and they're perfectly fine.
Okay.
Now this one, the Apostles' Creed. So I think I gave pretty much exhausted my knowledge as to where it comes from. So
When you turn us to Wikipedia, Doug,
as I
I'm sure
said,
we've reached the end.
it's a fine source sometimes at times. So yeah, I mean, it's fine. What I want to do though is ask about this question, like, where in the Bible would the notion be that Jesus descended into hell?
Sure.
And
And we're headed to Ephesians, right, Doug?
we are, as a matter of fact, Ephesians 4:8-9.
Sweet.
And so,
You want me to read it?
yeah, well, let me just give my answer beforehand. So this is where we're going, and that is that it's not in Scripture. It's not biblical. There's no biblical passage that clearly or even probably teaches that that Jesus. There's no passage in Scripture that convincingly teaches that Jesus went to hell when he died.
Sure.
So, all right. So go ahead and read Ephesians 4:8-9. This would be one of the two major texts where people get this from.
Sure. So Ephesians 4 verses 8-9 says, "Therefore it says, when he ascended on high, he led a host of captives and he gave gifts to men. In saying he ascended, what does it mean but that he had also descended into the lower regions, the earth? He who descended is the one who also ascended far above all the heavens that he might fill all things." This is the ESV version that I'm reading from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So now there's nothing there that would lead the casual reader to think that he descended into hell, right?
Right.
It's pretty clear. And that's because this reflects an understanding of the grammar of this verse that is probably correct. So let's get grammatical for a second here, okay? So look at the last words of that passage, right? So he had descended into the lower regions, comma, the earth. So if you were to take those two substantives there, lower regions, earth, there's a equal sign between them. The lower regions, which are the earth.
Sure.
Okay. And indeed, that's also reflected in the New International Version, which ends the lower earthly regions. Okay. That's, kind of like characteristic of the NIV to be a little less specific with the grammar if they think it's better in English that way, which is fine. This view is explicitly shows up in John Calvin's commentary on Ephesians. But there's earlier traditions, particularly before the late 19th century, and unfortunately, a lot of theological views do carry over from a lot of earlier theological views that are pretty clear are not correct to today, sometimes do carry over from ages past. That's not to say that we eschew tradition here or anything like that. Indeed, I just talked about how much I love creeds, but all I'm saying is that sometimes it's interesting how we miss a significant amount of scholarship, Christian scholarship, that's been taking place for quite some time. So if you go to the King James Version, look at how the King James Version words it. It talks about how Christ descended to the lower parts of the earth. Likewise, the New King James, which is a much more recent translation, the lower parts of the earth. So think of the difference there. The one, option A, the lower regions, which are the earth, right? Namely the earth. So it's talking about his incarnation. He descended to the earth. Or the lower parts of the earth. There, that's quite different. You have the earth, and what part of the earth did Jesus go to? The lower parts of it. And so you picture this kind of, biblical cosmology, I suppose we could say, where you've got the heavens and
The
you've got
three-tiered
the
kind of
three-tiered
universe.
kind of idea. Yeah. And we're not going to go into like how valid that is or whatnot, but that would be the idea. And so that then the idea there would be that by saying that Jesus descended into the lower parts of the earth, it's not talking about his incarnation. That's talking about his death. And it's talking about, namely, him going down. Now, I'll pause. So, all right, I'll pause there and just say that even if we were to accept that older view, that it is the lower parts of the earth, that that's the correct grammar of this passage, that still would not mean hell. Okay. That could just simply mean that he descended into Hades. And we've talked about that before. Real quick, when you run into passages, Sheol in the Old Testament, Hades in the New, it's almost always, except for maybe the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, it's almost always certainly the realm of the dead, just saying that he went to the grave. In fact, and this is what's interesting. So, I mentioned that the version of the creed we're talking about that says descended into hell, that's the current Catholic version. Right. Well, if you read a little bit of it in the Catechism of the Roman Catholic Church, everything's backwards on Zoom.
Your
so
library always, it reads right for me.
Yeah, it looks right for me too, but it's just weird. So it's interesting that this is the official doctrine of the Roman Catholic Church, and it's structured around the Apostles' Creed. And so this section, I'm not even going to try to show it on the screen. Article 5, he descended into hell, and on the third day he rose again. So they specifically talk about what they mean by saying that. Now notice how it words it here. So it says, the frequent New Testament affirmations that Jesus was raised from the dead presuppose that the crucified one sojourned in the realm of the dead prior to his resurrection. Right? This was the first meaning given in the apostolic preaching to Christ's descent into hell, that Jesus, like all men, experienced death and in his soul joined the others in the realm of the dead. Now, I don't know if it's obvious in just me reading it without, stopping and looking at the actual words, but they are defining hell in a non-standard way. So I just said that lower parts of the earth only requires us to say Jesus went into the realm of the dead, right? The Roman Catholic Catechism is calling that hell. In fact, in the very next paragraph, this is paragraph 633, it says, Scripture calls the abode of the dead, to which Christ went down, hell, Sheol in Hebrew, or Hades in Greek, because those who are there are deprived of the vision of God. Such is the case for all the dead, whether evil or righteous, while they await the Redeemer. You see what that's saying? So we would say, and I think most people would say, that translations or theologians who come across passages in Scripture that speak of Sheol and Hades, who say that this is referring to hell, we would say that's incorrect. Right? That's not what those terms mean in the Old or in the New Testament. The Roman Catholic Church, for some reason or another, disagrees with that and says that those are indeed references to hell. And I suppose what the proper way to say is they redefine hell, not so much that they redefine those places, right? Because that both righteous and wicked are there. They're just saying, so in other words, when a Christian dies and goes to be when a Christian dies and the resurrection has not yet happened, that person, I think they would say, is in hell because they're in the realm of the dead. So in essence, their version of the Apostles' Creed, according to the official doctrine of the Roman Church, also doesn't teach that Jesus went to hell, because they mean something different by hell. What they mean is what we would mean, is that Jesus went into the realm of the dead. He died.
That's interesting. I wonder how that interplays with like the Catholic doctrine of purgatory as well. You know what I mean? So
I think they would say, I think they would probably say everyone who dies goes to, well, I mean, at least according to what I'm seeing here,
Mm.
I think it would be everyone who dies goes to hell. And for some, hell begins with purgatory, and
Mm.
they are now. I don't think they would say that saints are in hell. I think they would say that saints are with the Lord, and they're rescuing the Christians who are in hell, the part of hell that is purgatory. So
Mm.
in other words, I think they'd say that there are different kinds of hell.
Mm.
So, but
And in all
yeah, it's
fairness, too, just disclaimer statement. I didn't grow up Catholic. I'm not overly familiar with any Catholic doctrine, and Doug, I know that a good amount of the information that you're reading from has come through trusted texts.
mhm.
But just disclaimer statement that neither of us are Catholic.
Yes. Nor, and I'm not even an ex-Catholic. There's never a time. I never actually attended a Catholic mass until I did with my aunt like 5 or 6 years ago. I attended a Christmas mass and may or may not have fallen asleep. Um,
All right, so
it was the
let me
midnight
ask you
mass.
this, Doug.
So
Then, so
yeah.
as we're looking at this, then what should we conclude about kind of what
Okay.
the idea
So
of Jesus descending
yeah,
is mostly coming from Ephesians, right? And so we have this here, and what can we conclude about this, knowing that
mostly.
with these
Yeah.
translations, it's suggesting that he went to the lower regions of the earth.
Although I do want to touch base on another passage before we're done.
Mm.
But yes, so the grammar of this verse is most likely to be understood as the lower regions, which are the earth. And without going into the meaning of Greek genitive nouns, that's about as far as I can say. So, but even if we go with the older way of translating it, the lower parts of the earth, that still would not mean he went to hell. It would mean he simply died. So the two ways of understanding this verse are either his dissension means going to death, or it means his incarnation when he was here on earth. It's completely foreign to the to the context, otherwise unbiblical, and grammatically unnecessary to say that he went to hell. It's a foreign idea to this text. I think that's where you take that away. If anybody does have questions about the specific grammar, it's not too hard to explain. You could just email me and that would be fine.
Sweet. And Doug, what's the best way for them to reach you?
Doug.becker@emergencenj.org.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So, Doug, we're running out of time here, but any final thoughts? Any other things that you want to cover real quick for before we close up Theology Thursday?
Just want to. Do you think I have time to just run through the First Peter text real quick? What do you think?
I will give you 3 minutes.
Oh, more than enough time.
Great.
Okay. All right. So here's a passage in the other passage where we might get this idea that Jesus went to hell. First Peter 3:18 through 19.
Crazy thing too is every time you say, like every time you even say the idea of Jesus went to hell, like gives me like goosebumps or something.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? Like it's like nails on a chalkboard, the idea of Jesus going to hell, but
yeah.
So he rules over.
I'm going to read that. You're chewing into my 3 minutes here.
I'm sorry.
All right. So for Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit, in which he went and proclaimed to the spirits in prison, because they formerly did not obey, when God's patience waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through water. All right. First off, here is Luther on this passage, Martin Luther. A wonderful text this is, and a more obscure passage perhaps than any other in the New Testament, so I do not know for certainty just what Peter means. And I would just say that is a perfectly fine thing to conclude about this passage. Like, you don't have to say, yeah, no problem, I got it. Like, this is a tough one. It's hard to know exactly what he's talking about. And that being the case, and even if you think you know what it means, like that, it being the case that it like that it is such a confusing passage for so many people, it's probably not best practices to base a doctrine on it, especially a doctrine that's not really found anywhere else in Scripture. Okay. So, but a couple things. So a couple different ways of interpreting this passage. Number one, ever since the time of Augustine, some have taken it to mean that Jesus in the Spirit went and preached during the days of Noah. So Jesus was somehow like there in spirit and was trying to preach alongside of Noah or something like that. Okay, so that's been an idea. Another idea is perhaps he's talking about Old Testament saints in general, which is a little hard with verse 20 because he does seem to anchor it in the days of Noah. Another thought would be, was this perhaps like, did Jesus somehow get incarnated back in time and talk and preach to sinful humanity that perished during the flood? Probably the most likely interpretation of this passage is that this is referring to his proclamation of victory over evil angels. Okay. So, and with particular reference to those who are mentioned right before the flood in Genesis 6, 1-4, which is that very strange passage about the sons of God coming and sleeping with the daughters of man and taking them as wives. Good, not enough time to get into that.
I know, Doug.
But
I've got so many questions I want to ask, and I'm holding back.
So, I will say that the idea using this text to say that this is referring to him going to hell, like it doesn't work that way. It's weird, whatever he's saying, but it's not saying that, because keep in mind the wording of the end of verse 18 into verse 19, right? He was put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit. So it's after Jesus is made alive that he's doing this. As I've discussed a little bit before, and I will discuss in my upcoming audio recording on the resurrection, being made alive in the spirit does not mean he's a disembodied being. It means he's empowered by the Spirit of God. But at any rate, he's alive during this. So probably what's going on here is that he's proclaiming his victory over the evil forces. Keep in mind that Revelation 20 verse 7 talks about Satan being imprisoned, right? And spirits with him. So it's not this like crazy idea that they would be considered in prison. This takes seriously the idea that he's preaching to spirits. That's usually what spirits mean, as opposed to just a way of referring to humanity. And there's also some connection here, apparently, with the book of First Enoch, which is also quoted in the book of Second Peter, or at least referred to in the book of Second Peter. So, but the salient point, I know that's a lot of stuff, and everything I just said there opens up into its own Pandora's box, but
thank you for saving that toward the end of the video there, Doug.
Yeah. The point here is that this is referring to, most likely, to Jesus. Number one, it's certainly not referring to his descent into hell, which is enough to establish our point. But what he is likely referring to is probably Jesus's proclamation of his victory over the evil spiritual beings.
Awesome.
So, yeah.
Cool. Doug, thank you so much. I know that there's a couple other rabbit trails that we would love to go on. I have a lot of questions myself, but we'll be sure to hit some of those in future iterations of Theology Thursday, as well as some of the deep dives that we record as well. Doug, thank you so much for your time today. Leaders and actually everybody that's tuning in from our church, if you've made it this far, well done. This is probably one of the longest videos, Doug, that you and I have ever recorded, but always fun and always really, really very insightful. I know I learned a lot today, Doug. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we will look forward to seeing you in future videos. Take care.